If you look at PV module manufacturing on the domestic side, we're pushing 50 gigawatts right now. However, we only have about 4 to 5 gigawatts of cell capacity in the US. That's 10%. We've got a long way to go for cell capacity in the US to have a 1-to-1 ratio for PV module to cell manufacturing. That's the big challenge right there. That's why it's important for the customer to understand not everyone can get a domestic PV cell.
Hello and welcome to the Solar Maverick Podcast, where solar meets entrepreneurship and experience. I'm your host, Benoy Thanjan, so let's get into it.
Hi, this is Benoy, your host of the Solar Maverick Podcast. I'm really excited on this episode to have Chris Lettman. He is with Imperial Star Solar. Chris and I now have known each other, I would say, for 12 to 13 years. I consider him a friend, then a colleague. Chris, welcome to the Solar Maverick Podcast.
Thanks, Benoy. Thanks. I really appreciate it. I think it's been at least 13 plus years at least. When we met, I was living on the East Coast and I think you were trading SRECs. I remember that conversation, one of the first conversations that kind of kicked off. And like you said, it's a friendship and first and foremost. And, that's one of the things that I think that I've experienced so much in this industry is so many great friendships, competitors and colleagues alike. And that's something that's really hard to experience in other industries. I've been in many other industries, and the solar industry is by far one of the more collaborative industries that I've worked in. So I'm very grateful for that.
Yeah, definitely. It's amazing. The people I've met become close friends throughout the years.
Sure.
I feel like I know you so well and your family. I met your wife at some of the conferences as well. And you're going to talk about some exciting stuff. You have like an amazing background because you've done a lot of different things within the industry. And then you worked at pharmaceutical healthcare and then were in the Marine Corps. Thank you for your service. All these experiences helped you where you are today. And
Absolutely.
Aerostar is amazing because it's solar designed and built in America.
Yeah, we opened up our Houston, Texas factory. We actually had the grand opening ceremony back in June of last year. We started rolling modules out in December in 2024. We're boasting a 2 gigawatt capacity right now, and we've got plans to expand that capacity by the end of this year, ramping up to 3 gigawatts. So we're actually adding another 1 gigawatt production line by the end of this year. So really exciting stuff. And, it couldn't come soon enough with the demand, with what's going on right now, with all the trade tariffs, with all the challenges that we see here with logistics and supply chain constraints and everything. So, it's been a long time coming, and it's great to see solar manufacturing, coming back and being here in the US.
Definitely. This is really timely because the Inflation Reduction Act has an adder related to U.S. domestic content. There's a Section 45X tax credit.
Yeah.
Can you talk about how things have been because of those incentives and also because of international tariffs? Has it been extremely busy for you from, everyone looking to get panels and just can't even imagine how busy it has been. I know I saw your Intersolar team and you guys had a big booth.
Absolutely. So 45X and the Inflation Reduction Act are some of the key drivers that brought us to Houston, Texas as a key area where we wanted to focus on setting up U.S. manufacturing. It addressed some major concerns, reshoring, onshoring U.S. manufacturing for solar panels. I think Houston, Texas in general was just a great location, being pretty much in the center of the country, close by the port of Houston and everything, to bring in some component that were being sourced globally, but also to serve the U.S. market, in any direction. That helped a lot. The Inflation Reduction Act, the 45X, those definitely helped, push forward the domestic manufacturing setup there. It addresses that need. It addresses the supply chain constraints. It addresses the overseas challenges that we're experiencing now, that we've been experiencing for many, many years now, decades, in fact, whether it's challenges with, ocean container delays or ocean container issues or going through different channels where there's a delay for one reason or another. Tariffs, in fact, are another challenge. And while we're still experiencing some of that right now, we're navigating those issues and, we're proactively staying ahead of the curve on that with all of our customers right now. These past few weeks have been incredibly busy, making phone calls, getting on the phone with our customers, getting on conference calls, Zoom calls, You name it, we're doing it, making sure that they're up to speed on what's going on, where their orders are, what's happening to the materials that are coming in from these various countries. Fortunately for us, most of the components are being sourced here domestically, which is great, because we're one of the few companies here that can have the domestic content adder with both the PV cell, which we are sourcing from Suniva, which is based out of Norcross, Georgia. And we've got a great relationship with them over there. We struck that deal mid last year and made that announcement pretty recently, and that's going well. We have a couple other components that we can source domestically as well, frame and junction box and a few other components. We can meet and or exceed the necessary threshold depending on the racking solution that is being used for the project to hit that number for 2025, 2026, and 2027. As you know, it increases 5% each year starting this year.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing, the partnership with Suniva and then really getting it from the cells. I mean, too about how, traceability, and if you want to talk about that. And I was going to go too into I thought was interesting, which was a natural progression, is like the domestic content calculator that you created with
Yeah.
Imperial Star Solar. Like, can you talk about like for
Yeah.
why it's important to have the cells manufactured in the US
Yeah.
because of
Absolutely.
traceability, and then go into domestic content calculator as well?
Absolutely. So traceability is very, very important, for obvious reasons. We need to assure our customers where the components are coming from. They need to be able to have that documented, for tax purposes and other legal reasons to show that the components are coming from where we're saying they're coming from. And what we saw was, some challenges with companies that are claiming or have domestic content. But the challenge is without that PV cell, Benoy, you're going to have a really hard time achieving the necessary thresholds, the baseline thresholds for each year that you need to meet or exceed that threshold in order to gain that 10% tax adder. That's what started the whole domestic IQ calculator on our website. Because what happened was we were talking to our customers, and during the course of the conversation, they're telling us, different companies are giving them different quotes and different information on their particular modules. And so we're kind of taking a step back here and having to, educate the customer, which is fine. We love doing that. We want to have that conversation with them. We thought, hey, let's take a proactive approach at this and get ahead of the curve here and let them know, first of all, what components we have, what we offer, and what that adds up to, depending on what kind of racking solution you're using. Are you using an inverter? Are you using a string inverter? Are you using a micro inverter? So that helps them out before they pick up the phone or before they start typing away and reach out to us and engage with us and ask us about module availability, delivery timelines and all that for their projects. That's really helping the customer and the EPCs and the developers, empowering them with information when they're ready to talk to us. They know what we have available in terms of domestic content components, so they can mix for a more efficient conversation, really.
Yeah, definitely. That is pretty interesting. And I know in the pre-interview we talked about it, but I guess right now it's kind of hard to compare apples to apples, right? When you talk about like pricing and then, where everything's coming from, to make sure everyone wants to make sure that it qualifies for domestic content.
Yeah. When I speak to a customer and, we're having that conversation about pricing and we get into the weeds about their project or their portfolio and whatnot. And, they're telling me, hey, Chris, you're giving me pricing and it's not even in the ballpark compared to company XYZ. And, and it's, let's say 10 cents a watt below what they're receiving. And I'll qualify that and, ask a little bit more and say, okay, that includes the domestic cell. And there'll be this little bit of uncomfortable silence for a few seconds. And then they'll tell me, well, let me get back to you on that. And then they'll call me back and they'll say, yeah, that doesn't include the cell. And then I say, okay, well, what other components are you using on the project, in terms of racking and inverters or whatever? And I say, okay, well, let's take this calculator out, have a little bit more robust calculator that we can actually use and demonstrate to our customers that are taking the next step, so to speak. And we'll plug in the numbers and I'll show them up on the screen. We're doing a video conference, whatnot. I don't see a clear path to gaining that or meeting or even coming close to that threshold that they need. And then again, there's that uncomfortable silence again. And they come to realize, okay, we're kind of stuck. We need to reevaluate things. Either maybe they don't want to go the domestic content route, or they need to reevaluate and maybe they need to look at procuring our modules. The thing is, at the end of the day, you can't be in a hurry. You can't be hasty in making the decision. You got to ask a lot of questions. And I'm saying this on behalf of the customer. You have to ask a lot of
Sure.
questions of the manufacturer. Ask, what are they using to ensure traceability? What are they using to ensure that, it meets or exceeds the domestic content requirements? I can't get into the details here on the podcast, Benoy, but we're doing that. We're doing all the necessary documentation and going above and beyond for our customers to make sure that we have what they need and beyond.
Yeah, definitely. That's great. And it's a lot of education for the customers. It should be more
Yeah,
simple, but it's been, made more complicated because
yeah,
of the investment tax credit and then tariffs
absolutely.
now. And then it's interesting because you talked about like how the company it has a vertically integrated approach. You mentioned the partnership with Suniva,
Yeah,
basically going from cells to wafers to modules. Like, how does that integration enhance product quality and supply
yeah.
chain reliability? I know during COVID, it was very difficult to
Yeah.
get,
So,
solar equipment. Yeah.
so just to be clear, we're vertically integrated from our Indonesia factory. So we are manufacturing wafers and cells from our Indonesia plant. Our relationship with Suniva, we're procuring the PV cell from them. So in technical terms, that does not make us vertically integrated here in the US. Now we are looking at the possibility of cell manufacturing and or possible JVs with companies. That's out there in the future to be determined at this stage. But I think that's important because, that's where things are going. If you look at PV module manufacturing on the domestic side, we're pushing 50 gigawatts right now. However, we only have about 4 to 5 gigawatts of cell capacity in the US. That's 10%. We've got a long way to go for cell capacity in the US to have a 1-to-1, ratio for PV module to cell manufacturing. That's the big challenge right there. That's why it's important for the customer to understand not everyone can get a domestic PV cell because you have 50 gigawatts of PV module manufacturing, but you only have about 5, maybe 6 gigawatts of cell manufacturing. There's a couple companies coming online recently. I know ES Foundry recently announced I think it's 3 gigawatt factory in South Carolina. That's great. Love to hear that happening. We're speaking to them as well. Nothing official yet. And there's a couple other companies, and there's a couple companies in Texas, and I think in the Midwest too as well. It's encouraging to hear it. And we need more cell manufacturing to match what we have in capacity on the module manufacturing side. And the great thing about that is as the module manufacturing continues to grow and continues to ramp up and more facilities open up, now we see more cell factories open up. Behind that, we're going to see more frame companies, more glass, more J-box, the other components,
Sure.
encapsulants, back sheets, et cetera. In fact, I think the next one that we really need to see a lot of is glass. Glass is there's a big shortage on that domestic glass
Interesting.
manufacturing. Yeah.
This is
Yeah.
really interesting. And what do you do too? Like when you have customers and they're like, I'm sure everyone wants your US domestic content produced panel. What happens when you don't have supply? Yeah.
Yeah. I don't want to say it's a good problem to have. I mean, right now I've actually have a few customers that don't want the domestic cell. They just want a domestic frame, domestic J box with imported cell. So
Interesting.
yeah, because the way that they've structured their domestic content for their particular projects, and it's very nuanced. When you start building out the project, it's very nuanced to how, what racking solution and inverters and everything that they're using. Fortunately for these customers, they only need the J box and the frame and maybe one other component like the encapsulant or the backsheet from us, the module manufacturer. So we're able to use that, supply that module from our Houston, Texas factory get them that module with, maybe that comes out to right around, let's see, do some quick math here. I don't know, maybe 7 to 9%, maybe 11% domestic content. They don't need that 45, 50% because it's an aggregate total, right? Across all of the components,
Yeah.
your module, your inverter, and your racking solution, as long as you've got that first pass requirement, which is all steel is 100% US made.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
I appreciate you
Yeah.
explaining this. It's a lot more
Yeah,
challenging.
it is. And these are the conversations we have day in and day out.
For
Um,
sure.
and there's always, and it never gets settled in one conversation. There's always, several rounds of conversations and follow-ups and confirmation of, what was said previously and everything. So, and that's fine. That's fine. That's why, like I said earlier, you got to take your time.
Yeah, definitely. It's a complicated purchase, and
It is.
you have to
Yeah.
make sure that, well, I guess, to maximize the benefit, I've spent a lot of time understanding all the different components related
Yeah.
to the purchasing decision.
Yep.
And then can you talk about too, like, how does Imperial Star plan to leverage technology advancements to stay ahead in, the competitive solar manufacturing sector? Everything, seems to always be changing, and
Oh, yeah.
there's technology innovations, and there's AI. Everyone's talking about that. And then
Yeah.
you're talking about producing cells domestically here in the US. That's not that big. And
Yeah.
there's
Yeah.
so many different things, capacity too, right?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, we have plans to expand our domestic module manufacturing in Houston, Texas, as I mentioned earlier. We continue to invest in automation. We continue to invest in AI, advanced manufacturing, and continue to, maintain our industry leadership. That's important. With regards to cell manufacturing here in the US, we're looking at strategic partnerships because that we have our experience, our wafer and cell manufacturing experience globally. We're able to leverage that experience and partner up with another company here in the US and use that experience to, potentially create a, cell manufacturing here in the US. That is being looked into as well. So, automation, AI, all that for quality control is going to drive, continued precision and efficiency throughout the manufacturing process.
Yeah, exciting times. And there's
It
always
is.
in the solar industry, always innovation.
You got to come out to the factory.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I should be in Houston the beginning of September. I would love to see it. I've been to other panel manufacturers,
Sure.
even internationally. You know what I was surprised, Chris, was like how much a lot of it's just done by robotics. There's not a lot of
Oh yeah.
humans involved in the
Yep.
process. That kind of blew me away. And I'm
Yeah.
sure it's getting even more and more like that. Like I was surprised there were not that many people in
Yeah.
the PV panel
Oh yeah.
manufacturing facility. And
We're over 90% automated. We're over
yeah,
90% automated. So you're not going to see, while we're providing great quality jobs in the Houston area, we're providing over 300 jobs right now. And, with our expansion, that's going to increase. But you're not going to see a lot of people on the floor. I mean, 300 people, it's a great number, in comparison to the size of the facility and what we're churning out in terms of modules. It's really not a lot, because of the automation percentage.
sure. Oh, that's amazing. And I know in the beginning of the interview, I talked about like how you have like maybe 13 years of experience in renewable energy and solar in a lot of different parts of the
Yeah.
industry. Can you talk about like what your background is and how?
Yeah, so I'm actually just over 16 years now, Benoy. It feels like yesterday. So I started out in, small commercial in the agricultural part of South New Jersey, developing projects and, moved up from there and everything from, continued to develop projects. I ran my own shop for 7 years, brokering projects in the C&I and utility scale sectors. And, recently just got back into the equipment side about 3 years ago here with Imperial Star Solar. And then, as you mentioned, prior to that, I was in the pharmaceutical industry for just over 10 years. And actually, I don't think we've talked about this, but I actually have over 10 years manufacturing experience in the plastics industry. Right after my time in the Marine Corps, right after I got out, I was in manufacturing for about 10 years.
Oh, that's amazing. I'm sure that knowledge helps now, right? With
Everything I've
yeah,
done leading up until last Friday has helped me where I'm at today. I mean, no joke, no
that's
joke, man.
true.
It's very true. I mean, we take what we've learned, from past experience, past careers, good and bad, and we apply it to what we're doing today. And I do that with 100% belief and passion that, everything I've done beforehand has helped me where I'm at right now. And I know what I learned today, what I talk about today, and who I speak with today is going to help me tomorrow.
For sure.
Yeah.
And how has project brokering or project development helped
Oh,
with going back to like
back
module
to oh my
six?
gosh. Yeah. You know what? Relationships. For the 7 years that I was doing the project M&A, all I spoke to, were project developers. And, that has helped me get my foot in the door, speaking to a lot of these companies that are now my customers, and it's allowed me to, continue that relationship with these companies just in a different department, so it's not a cold call. It's not meeting maybe one, two people from a different department for the first time, but, I'm getting recommendations from different people from different departments on the development side, on the origination side, on the project finance side, on the legal side. And I really appreciate those relationships. I don't discredit them. I don't take them for granted. In other words,
Yes, that's
because let's face it, there's a lot of options out there on the PV module side, and relationships matter. I know that's a phrase we hear often. You can't say that enough. Relationships do matter in any industry, but especially in this industry that we're in.
yeah, definitely. That's so true. It's all a relationship business.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
were recently at, I think, Intersolar and then InfoCast, right? Solar
Infocast. Yeah. Out
and
in Phoenix.
finance
Yep.
in Phoenix. Like, what major takeaways did you have from those conferences outside of like what we've already spoken about?
Yeah, so a couple of things. I think the first one, which was really fun for me anyways, was we were out there for the first time last year. And, folks would walk by the table last year and say, Imperial Star, who are you guys? What do you do? And then this year was Imperial Star, I've heard of you guys, or I need to talk to you. So the different conversation, and that was really fun. And the other takeaway was really the big theme was from the tax equity side and domestic content. And, they had heard about us already, so they knew about our domestic content offering. So those were the main topics of the conversation when they walked up. We had a lot of scheduled meetings and appointments already with some of our current customers and prospective customers, but those that were walking up for the first time had already heard about us. So, it was great to see that big of a turnaround in, a 12-month period. So that was exciting. And there was a lot of conversations, a lot of interest with the domestic content for sure.
Yeah, definitely. Can you talk about that too? That's pretty amazing, right? Because the company started, right, solar PV manufacturing in 2020. You talked about the Houston plant and the output of the plant, the
Yep.
partnership with Suniva for cells. Like, how has that been like with a relatively new company building a
Yeah.
name, having people? It sounds like, you're having success with.
Yeah. So being a new name in the US market, but having, the global experience for well over a decade as an OEM manufacturer, starting with wafers and cells and then PV modules, coming from Cambodia and then Indonesia. So we still have our Indonesia factory. It's a 3 gigawatt factory, PV module manufactory, and then also the wafer and cell factory in Indonesia. So that continues to, be operational. So that's where our roots are from. But from the US market and, being established here in the US, we're relatively new. But, this being, global economy and, the PV industry in general, especially with PV modules, most people already knew us, from other countries.
That's great as
Yeah.
well, right? Because a lot of these companies are international. So,
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
and are you Bloomberg tier one or?
Not yet. We definitely have a clear line of sight for that. We are working with a few projects right now that will qualify us, that meet the criteria. We're definitely getting there. I don't want to put a date on it. It's definitely getting there. The interesting thing is because I've had this conversation with some of my customers when that tier one question comes up, but they need domestic content modules. Some tier one manufacturers are not domestic content qualified or eligible, or some don't have enough components to meet the threshold that they need for their project to meet that hurdle. So what's happening is we're having some companies kind of waive that requirement because we have the domestic content components that they need in order to satisfy their requirements. It's actually helping us, towards the tier one requirement because those projects are in excess of 10 megawatts. In fact, some of them are in excess of 100 megawatts. We've actually pre-sold well over 600 megawatts this year alone.
Oh, wow. That's amazing.
Yeah, yeah. So it's pretty incredible. But it goes back to our OEM experience too, as well. Some of
Sure.
these customers, they know us from other companies. They know that we've always for, or white label, whatever term you want to use for tier one companies. Interesting enough, it's something, a lot of people don't know or don't realize that being tier one doesn't necessarily mean that you actually made the module.
Yes.
So that's something that a lot of people are unaware of.
That is really interesting to me because, so many companies have gone back and forth off the tier one and list or gone
Yeah.
bankrupt. And it's interesting to me because, that never took into account what you said is like where these things are actually being made, right? Because over time, and that's interesting to me too, like you have to sell a certain amount to be considered bankable by Bloomberg tier one. And that's interesting.
We can make a tier one module that's listed on the Bloomberg list, but we're not a tier one module yet.
That's really interesting. And then if you're qualifying for domestic adder, like that's probably more important.
And that's what I meant. Some of these companies are waiving that requirement. The thing about Imperial Star Solar, the great thing, I think, is we've got some really outstanding references, some customer references, some multi 100 megawatt customer references, some really notable customers that are more than happy to answer the call or reply to an email and respond to a question about our quality, about our customer service. So that's, a testament to, the quality of the module, the quality of the company. So it says a lot about us, I think. I'm really proud about that.
That's huge. That
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
obviously great to have. And
Yeah, it
so,
is.
yeah, I mean, that's a big differentiator. And I'm sure I've heard that it's very hard to get US domestic produced panels, right now as capacity expands.
Yeah.
It would be easier, but that all the stuff takes time.
Yeah, when you look at the, like I'm going to reference the 2025-08 safe harbor table that came out mid last year, late last year. This is the table that has the breakdown of all the components, the value of the individual components based on the type of racking solution that's being used, right? So that's basically kind of like the guidebook, if you will, or the guidelines that all developers and EPCs are using in determining, okay, what's my roadmap? Where do I need to be in order to, meet and or exceed what I need and value in terms of which year the project is being constructed and commissioned by in order to get that additional 10% tax adder. So
For sure.
that's an important tool for them to use. And then when they see, that we have that PV cell right there by far, that's the lion's share on the value table there. It's the top number. It's the first component on the table there. It ranges in anywhere between 30 on up to 50% value, depending on the racking solution.
Yeah,
So, yeah,
definitely.
you got to have it.
Yeah, for sure. I appreciate you explaining about that. I mean, that's really like educational for
Yeah.
our listeners who we call Mavericks. And the Solar Maverick podcast is about solar and entrepreneurship too. And you're internally an entrepreneur within, Imperial Star. And then you've also had your own business too,
Yeah.
your consulting business. Can you talk about like what suggestions you would have for anyone being an entrepreneur within the solar coaster that you now have 16 years of
Yeah.
experience being in?
I would say go out there and find a mentor. Find someone that is knowledgeable and has passion in what they do and can help you and guide you, isn't afraid to have you kind of shadow them. And depending on what you're wanting to do, whether it's, more on the technical side, construction side, the finance side, the sales side, business development, or the legal side, there's plenty of avenues to go down in this industry and plenty of opportunities for everyone out there interested. You just got to ask a lot of questions and go out there and chase them down.
Yeah, definitely. That is great advice. I appreciate that,
Sure.
Chris. And then just quickly too, like we talked about a lot of different things, a lot of trends already in the industry, in the solar industry. Is there any trends that we haven't spoke of?
I think we're just going to continue to see more and more component manufacturers come into the US with the pricing pressures, with the tariff pressures now that we're seeing. We're going to see more of these components come into the US by necessity because it's going to make things a little bit easier for the PV module manufacturers to source these components domestically. It's going to add incrementally more percentage points to that domestic content module, and it's going to set up shop here in the US. It's going to create a few more jobs every time another factory opens up, whether it's glass or backsheet or encapsulant, what have you.
Yeah, definitely. That's so true. And that's a great trend to end with. And this has been an amazing interview, Chris. Is there anything
Thank
else
you.
that we haven't spoken about regarding Imperial Star Solar?
Just reach out to us on LinkedIn, follow us on LinkedIn. If you have any questions, you can contact me through LinkedIn, my page, I'm up there. I'm pretty active through the LinkedIn social media type, website and everything. So I'm happy to chat with anyone out there that's interested in learning more about domestic content.
Yeah, definitely. I am enjoying all the content that you're putting out online on LinkedIn.
Thanks,
We'll
Benoy.
obviously
Thank
have
you.
that on the notes of the podcast, your videos
Great.
as well. Like, I appreciate you making the time. I think this was really like educational, and I'm excited to see too. Like, this is just really the beginning of domestic
It is.
manufacturing
Yeah.
for Imperial Star and just in general in the US. And I'm excited to hear about the growth and
Yeah.
excited to stop by your manufacturing facility in Houston
Yeah, for sure. You have an
sometime
open
this year.
invitation. You have an open invitation, my friend.
Thank you again, Chris. This was amazing.
Okay. Thanks, Benoy.
Thanks for listening to the Solar Maverick Podcast. The Solar Maverick Podcast is brought to you by Reneu Energy. We're a solar development and consulting firm. If you believe that this podcast is adding value to you, please give us a 5-star review and share with those that you think could benefit from this information. Please email all questions, suggestions, and feedback to info@reneuenergy.com. That's info@reneuenergy.com. The Solar Maverick Podcast is produced by Podcast Laundry and executive produced by Benoy Thanjan and Kevin Y. Brown.